One of the best things about playing old games in general is the hunt. Looking for things that are interesting, titles that may have slipped through the cracks, ones that might have just never made any impact at all, or are just forgotten to time, whether they're good or bad. I'd like to make some shorter format videos to highlight such efforts, and this one here's the first of them. A little gem from the golden age of the arcades, something that wasn't the most famous game from a rather storied developer and has become somewhat anonymous as the years have gone by, but has enough cool ideas that it warrants a little look. Reactor, a 1982 arcade from Gottlieb, seems like as good a place to start as any. It's the sort of arcade that you would probably expect from them for reasons that we'll go into, and while it's not their most famous game, it got some pretty good notices at the time, and it's definitely worth firing up in MAME. The majority of the Chicago-based Gottlieb's existence was, of course, spent on the creation of pinball machines, something that they did to a pretty high standard from the 1930s onwards. However, in the world of video games, something that they got into in around 1980, they're undoubtedly most famous for Bert, he of the jumping on blocks, foiling eternal rival Coily, and spewing out garbled bad language whenever he gets caught. Quite a lot of Gottlieb's arcades do have little quirks that call back to their decades of pinball experience, one of the most famous perhaps being the little solenoid inside Bert's cabinet that would trigger whenever the little guy or Coily fell off the stage, momentarily making you think that the arcade was going to blow up. Meanwhile, Reactor here is more akin to an arcade game that is very much inspired by pinball, a physics-based title that doesn't play an awful lot like most other Golden Age titles, but speaks to the creativity and invention that was rife in the Golden Age of the arcades. Created almost entirely by the late great Tim Skelly, the goal of Reactor is to cool down the big old nuclear power source in the centre of the screen that's forever expanding by either using your cursor to knock the various hostile particles flying around into the kill wall that surrounds it, or specifically knocking them into the sets of control rods on either side that'll cool down the reactor during a stage. Touching the power source doesn't actually take you out, at least not at first, but as it expands it will drastically limit the playing area. In short, you're going to be bouncing into a lot of things, bashing them repeatedly so that they hit the kill wall while being careful not to touch it yourself. This was originally a trackball game with two buttons, one to release more energy and the other to use a decoy that can help attract particles to the wall. Although if you don't have a trackball at your disposal, this plays perfectly fine either with a joystick or a mouse. There are also two bonus chambers in the play area. Knocking particles into these little areas is a pretty good way to beef up your score, if you're able to do it.
16 left. 8 left.
The gameplay in Reactor is, as you might expect, pretty frenetic and addicting. There's something naturally entertaining about trying to herd all of these particles together and bash them into the wall, while just about scraping by yourself, especially as the power source gets particularly large. It certainly looks like a simple game, even by the standards of 1982, but the sparse presentation actually works very well for the title, with a few other things that really help it along, such as using the Votrack speech synthesizer that was a pretty common addition to Gottlieb's arcades, and the actually quite neat grungy music for the game. Whenever you reach the high score table, or complete a full cycle, you'll get a nice and dirty riff, contributed by David Field. This would have certainly been an experience on the original cabinet. It's a slightly smaller and boxier affair than most regular uprights, and it's got two speakers that are positioned directly on the marquee, so it's most certainly designed so that the bouncing of the particles and those occasional crunchy synthesised guitar tones go right down into your ear canal. It's also happy to change things up a little bit as you progress further, with things such as the initial reactor being replaced by a much more lethal vortex that's designed to suck you in, all those familiar kill walls becoming invisible. Another thing most certainly worth noting about the game is a little bit of an arcade first. This was the first arcade game to actually directly credit the developer, Tim Skelly, on the title screen, something that Skelly had demanded be written into his freelance contract with Gottlieb. This practice was pretty uncommon in the early days of the arcade, with the game's staff often doing things like putting their initials in the high score table as an unofficial credit. But happily, Reactor does things differently.
24 left.
It appears as though a couple of thousand Reactor arcade units were built, and the game got some pretty positive notices in the publications of the time. It also received a home port to the Atari 2600, published by Parker Brothers in 1983. It's a perfectly good port of the arcade original, even if it wasn't controlled with a trackball. If you've never actually played Reactor before, then it's absolutely worth going out of your way to do so. Tim Skelly had a quite wonderful career in video games and the arcade, including a bunch of rather innovative vector titles for Cinematronics, as well as later work inside Incredible Technologies, Sega, and Microsoft, but Reactor is often regarded as the man's crowning achievement, not just for the unique aspects of the game and its unmistakable quality, but also for his insistence that he be credited for the work that he put into the game, something which would become much more commonplace in the years to come. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little look at an arcade gem, and until next time, bye for now.